Are you familiar with the story of Odysseus? Are there any modern interpretations of the story of Odysseus? What can Derek Walcott's The Odyssey teach us? In this video, I'll try to answer these questions, so stay with me. Derek Alton Walcott was born in 1930 and he passed away in 2017. He was a post-colonialist and postmodernist poet and also playwright. He was born on the island of St. Lucia, which is a former British colony in the West Indies. His major breakthrough came with a collection titled In a Green Night, Poems 1948 to 1960. This is a book which celebrates the Caribbean archipelago and its history, and it also investigates the scars of colonialism. His major works consists of Dream on Monkey Mountain, which was published in 1967, Homeros, which was published in 1990, and White Egrets, which was published in 2007. He won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1992, MacArthur Foundation Genius Award, a Royal Society of Literature Award, and also the Queen's Medal for Poetry. Now let's talk about The Odyssey, a stage version, and the theme of Nostos, or homecoming. This play follows the Greek mythic hero Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, and his journey back home after the Trojan War. The Trojan War lasted for 10 years, and Odysseus' journey back home takes additional 10 more years. During the 10-year journey back home, he encounters many perils and all of his crewmates are killed. In Odysseus' absence, he is assumed dead, and his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus have to deal with a group of suitors that forcefully want Penelope's hand in marriage. One of the themes in ancient Greek literature is the epic hero's return back home. In ancient Greek society, the returning back home is considering a high level of heroism. And this return home is not just about the physical form of it, but also retaining a certain status and their identity upon arrival. In this video, I focus on an article entitled A Second Troy, Nostos and the Poetics of Delirium and Violence in Derek Walcott's Odyssey. First, let's talk about the impressions of Odyssey on the scholars. Odysseus' Nostos, or return back home, and also the story of Cyclops which he encounters, attracted critical attention from scholars. For example, Laura Hardwick, Robert Hamner, and Peter Burian talk about Odysseus' psychological ordeal, delusion, and madness in his showdown with the suitors. On the other hand, Maeve Tynan finds a relationship between Odysseus' madness to his inner struggle with the sea journey and his desire for adventure and also yearning for homecoming. On the other hand, Edith Hall examines different reconfigurations of Book 22 of Homer's Odyssey, the massacre in the Great Hall, in movies, literature, and books of psychology, including Walcott's stage adaptation of the story of Odysseus. They ask that, is Odysseus' violence confrontation with the suitors morally justified? The story of Odysseus also attracted the critical attention of Justin McConnell. She elaborates on the ways in which Jonathan Shea associates: first, returning war veterans; second, combat trauma; and third, difficulty to reconcile with homeland, to Odysseus's challenging experience of Nostos in Ithaca. McConnell relates Odysseus's violence and madness to: first, his war experience; second, decade-long exile; third, the alienation experience of his retour or return. She compares Odysseus's violent execution of the suitors with Cyclops' cruelty. She argues that Cyclops and Odysseus violate the code of Xenia, which is a Greek tradition of being kind to your guests. This article focuses on Eduard Glissant and Frantz Fanon. Glissant analyzes Odysseus's madness through the concept of détour and verbal delirium, whereby Odysseus becomes a delirion, or a mad person, after his brutal massacre of the suitors. But why Odysseus's mind disintegrates? How delirium and insanity have a therapeutic effect on his mind, and also how this reintegration makes his Nostos possible. Fanon, on the other hand, argues that colonial rule is maintained through violence and repression. Thereby, only violent retaliation of the colonized can release them from the psychological oppression of colonialism and restore their sense of self. Colonized people always experience internalized sense of inferiority, impotence and alienation, ensuing damage done to their psyches, all of which resonates very well with Odysseus's predicament in Ithaca. However, we cannot immediately view Odysseus's character as a colonized subject, because as a warrior in Troy, he is aligned with the master or colonizer. On the other hand, back home when he returns to Ithaca, he is aligned more with slave or colonized. Odyssey is a colonizer who is now colonized. The changes that have occurred over his 20-year absence from his homeland have displaced him from his home, rupturing his authority, history, and identity in Ithaca before his retaliation starts. The sense of estrangement and helplessness in his homeland puts him under extreme psychological pressure. You need to remember that he left Ithaca as a king and now he is nobody. In this respect, Odysseus' psychological burden can be likened to that of the colonized person, who have suffered under the exploitative and repressive authority of the colonialism. Here we have to remember that Odysseus initially didn't want to go to the Trojan War. He was forced and basically dragged to the war. We have two variations of détour. First, we have disguise, either verbal or physical, and the second, we have the détour of madness and verbal delirium. These are strategies of survival and resistance for Odysseus. Of the various categories of verbal delirium, théâtralisation or dramatization particularly illuminates Odysseus' situation. Let's first talk about the detour of disguise at home. From the play we have "Let his stories be told. He's a mariner old, and his head is turning white as the foam, scorched by the sun, cracked by the cold, and the long sing the song, and the long, long away from home." After this passage within the play, we see that Odysseus finds home in chaotic disorder. Home to him was once a space of security and familiarity, becomes estranged and threatening. He experiences irreverence towards his authority and loses all power. He is also forced to wander at the edge of his empire while the suitors enjoy their settlement in his home, while they are waiting to win the queen's hand in marriage. All of these reasons contribute to his unfulfilled nostos. Fanon and the relationship between natives and settlers in colonized contexts versus Ithacan contexts. Odysseus's home is analogous to a colony that is occupied by the suitor settlers. Relationship between Odysseus and the suitors is analogous to the displaced native and the colonizer. Although Odysseus is a king with an established kingdom and a home, his alienating experience turns home into an unsettling space of unfamiliarity and discomfort. And all these changes render Odysseus's return difficult. Odysseus's return. Home or Ithaca looks strangely disordered to Odysseus. He is assailed by his past, and the situation has become more complicated by the changes that have taken place in Ithaca in his absence. In Homi Bhabha's terms, Odysseus is like a subject that inhabits the rim of an in-between reality. Odysseus the beggar, a detour of disguise. Athena advises Odysseus to disguise himself as a beggar to avoid the threatening situation. Odysseus must make himself undecipherable in order to secure his life from the malice of the wild boars. This is how attire acts as a detour of disguise. Detour in Glissant's theories. Detour or diversion in Michael Dash's translation is a seminal concept in Glissant's theories. To Glissant, detour is not a systematic refusal to see. It is neither a kind of self-inflicted blindness nor a conscious strategy of flight in the face of reality. Rather, it is formed like a habit from an interweaving of negative forces that go unchallenged. The double function of detour. As Celia Britton contends, detour has a double function. First, on the one hand, it circumvents the situation. On the other hand, it stubbornly attempts to overcome it. Thereby, detour tactically both confronts and evades the problem. This is how Odysseus's attire makes his presence possible in Ithaca while simultaneously protecting him from the possible threats. linguistic and physical levels of detour of disguise. The detour of disguise can act on both linguistic and physical levels. In Ithaca, Odysseus resorts to both forms of disguise. To negotiate meaning, Odysseus the beggar's speech becomes double-edged. The element of disguise obstructs the suitor-settler's understanding of the hidden significance of his speech or action. This is how detour, as Glissant uses it, works as a defensive tool for self-preservation where there is an inequality in power structures. Conflation of past and present. Odysseus comes to this realization that the things he has lost in the war are more than its trophies. A war whose cause is now shrouded in smoke. Ithaca, like Troy, is surrounded and plundered by the invaders. Listen to the wind outside, Eumaeus. You hear it, and the fire is raging, like Troy's. What a far cause! A black man's storm galloping with Troy's wild horses, wilder since the war. God, what a man! No man left. Here Walcott portrays the conflation of past and present that leads to such confounding moments for Odysseus. The pointlessness of war through the mind of winner, the victor who has returned home only to suffer the reverberations of the war. If the winner suffers the agonies of war, how much more wretched is the loser? In addition to the mentioned temporal and spatial confusion, Odysseus is mocked in his own house. Such a circumstance requires Odysseus to suppress his anger on many occasions and withstand his humiliation. When his house servants are insolent or rebuke him, he is careful not to answer insult with insult. For example, when Melantho trips over Odysseus and kicks him, she says, "You near me made me fall, you homeless parasite. Sorry, but girl, have some respect for your elders." In this occasion, he doesn't answer insult with insult. He suppresses his anger. His beggar's disguise facilitates Odysseus' presence in Ithaca, but at the same time it limits his freedom of speech and action. This situation is similar to the plight of the colonized natives, who in Fanon's vision were condemned to servitude by colonialism. This unfamiliar experience pushes Odysseus to the interstices of identity, space, and time. He is neither king nor a beggar. He is neither home nor away. He is neither in the past nor in the present. The past torments him, and Ithaca does not welcome him. The intrusion of suitor settlers shattered the notion of home as a safe and secure space for him. Cathartic and liberatory effects of violence. Alienated by the present, tormented by the past, and choking on the suffocating chaos of what has become of his home, Odysseus resorts to violence to overcome his unhomeliness. This resonates with Fanon's argument about the cathartic and liberatory effects of violence. Massacre and the violence in the hall as an act of decolonization, a national liberation. Odysseus must end their siege. He must take action, use violence as a response to violence. Fanon argues that the violence of the colonial regime and the counter-violence of the native balance each other. Odysseus's confrontation with the suitors and the ensuing massacre is analogous to decolonization, where the colonized natives, on a mission of national liberation, wage a battle to reclaim their nation from the grip of the colonizers. Reversed situation. The problem Odysseus faces is the unbalanced proportion of the native and the suitor settlers. Fanon argues that the settler-native relationship is a mass relationship. The settler pits brute force against the weight of the numbers. He is an exhibitionist. His preoccupation with security makes him remind the native outlaw that there he alone is master. The settler keeps alive in the native an anger which he deprives of outlet. The native is trapped in the tight links of the chains of colonialism. However, the situation in Ithaca is reversed. The suitor settlers outnumber the natives. It is 3 to 100, but on the other hand, Odysseus is supported by Athena. She sends swallows to help him, and also Telemachus, his son, brings them weapons to help him. In parallel with Fanon's colonized subject, and without showing any compromise, Odysseus harms, slays, and mutilates the suitors and their helpers, effectively bringing to an end the 3-year reign of chaos in Ithaca. The violence of Odysseus's retaliation corresponds with Fanon's assertion that aggression is the means through which the objective to release oneself from the physical and psychological oppression of colonialism can be achieved. The colonized man finds his freedom in and through violence. This rule of conduct enlightens the agent because it indicates to him the means and the end. Fanon contends that cleansing force of violence sets free the inferiority complex of the colonized subject together with his sense of despair and inaction. The trauma of Trojan War being revived. The violent act of decolonization restores Odysseus's pride, dignity, and authority, but the massacre disorients him as it projects the past into the private sphere of his home. The bloodshed is reminiscent to him of Troy's battlefield and revives for him the trauma of Trojan War. With the gradual eruption of war memories in Odysseus' mind, his speech exemplifies the delirium of a man gone insane. Glissant, however, perceives madness in a positive light, as a detour of resistance and survival. Post-massacre and the detour of delirium. According to Britain, Glissant's concept of madness and delirium shares important resonance with Baba's notion of unhomely. As Baba contends, life in an unhomely world depends on the distinctions one may find between control and accommodation. We ought to concern ourselves with the understanding of human action and the social world as a moment when something is beyond control, but it is not beyond accommodation. Britain first relates Baba's notion of accommodation to Glissant's conception of detour, but then reasons that in the context of individual anxiety and the threat of psychosis, accommodation more strongly echoes Glissant's concept of delirium as a strategy for survival and resistance. Delirium in the domain of language. Verbal delirium has two categories. First one, pathological verbal delirium, and the second one, routine or customary verbal delirium. The differences are: routine verbal delirium may be resolved by political action. In routine verbal delirium, the deliriant or the mad person participates in society, while the pathological deliriant is isolated from it. Odysseus can be identified as a routine verbal deliriant because he is not alienated from others when his speech becomes delirious. In Le Discours Antilier, Glissant classifies subcategories of verbal delirium according to two features. First, delirium could be either elite or popular. Second, it could be either depropriating or reappropriating in form. Odysseus does not fit the polarity of elite-popular. Instead, he is more appropriately identified as the native in the native-settler dichotomy. Regarding the second feature, as Britain argues in the colonial context of depropriating, the deliriant obviously attempts to be identified as French by mimicking the language and culture of the colonizer. This is in a case in which French people are the colonizers, of course. Whereas in the latter, which can be viewed as a form of detour, the deliriant attempts to reconcile with the contradictions of society. Walcott's Odysseus mimics neither the language of the suitors nor their culture. He speaks English and his speech is lucid. Well, of course, except for the post-massacre scene when his mind is disintegrating. Glissant claims routine verbal delirium is a reflex reaction to the contradictions experienced in a social situation. Odysseus's disequilibrium can be viewed as his reflex response to the confused boundaries between Ithaca and Troy. The boundary separating the safe and secure space of home and non-home, as Baba theorizes, has been blurred. Categories of routine verbal delirium: dramatization, communication, representation, and persuasion. First two are both considered popular forms. On the other hand, the second two are considered both for elites. On the other hand, dramatization is reappropriating, while the others are considered depropriating. Thereby, from all the categories mentioned here, only dramatization functions as reappropriating. It should be mentioned that pathological delirium is also reappropriating, but I earlier discussed that Odysseus' situation is more consistent with routine verbal delirium. Thereby, at this point, dramatization best describes Odysseus' situation. Resistance and accommodation. Glissant suggests, as Odysseus wrestles with the shadows of his past, The retrieval of the past is both maddening and healing. The madness of delirium can constitute a tactic of resistance and accommodation. Trauma of war causing madness. James McCorkle argues the present is always mediated by historical knowledge. Odysseus identifies the Greek kings and warriors with the suitors and thinks the Trojan War is about to begin, but he refuses to go to war. You should keep in mind that in the beginning of the story, Odysseus didn't want to go to Trojan War. He was forced to enter the war. And here again, he thinks that he has to go to war, but he doesn't want to. In this historical present, the trauma of history is revived in his mind, and this gradually brings him to the verge of madness and delirium. Odysseus, the dramatizing delirium. Odysseus voices the torments of history, and by reviving the Trojan War, he attempts to dramatically reappropriate his disordered home and fragmented family from the invaders. While in other forms of verbal delirium, history is repressed or refused. One of the features of dramatic verbal delirium is that it externalizes and voices the traumas of history. Odysseus, a public figure voicing the traumas of war. Elizabeth Eduard claims the concept of deviance or delirium is a sign of social awareness and a necessary step in dodging alienation. Odysseus is a victor who does not boast of triumph. He has awakened to the reality and naked truth of war. He verbalizes trauma of war. There is no glory in war. Indeed, this is a positive aspect of dramatic delirium, where the delirium or the mad person voices the traumas of war. Hence, Odysseus is identified as mad. However, through this frantic dramatization, he obliges the community to look at itself as this way of observing is both necessary and important. Odysseus, as a victor in war, has, among other things, suffered exile and alienation, as well as post-war psychic imbalance. That is why he becomes infuriated when Billy Blue talks about Troy's glory. The glory now is a lie to Odysseus, the great warrior. War is a large-scale conflict. His family has also been afflicted by its reverberations. In dramatizing verbal delirium, the delirium or the mad person plays the role of a public figure or an actor on stage who, while externalizing and reappropriating reality through speech, brings awareness to his community. The role of Odysseus in drama. Britain claims the public role accomplishes the social function associated with dramatizing delirium. In spite of his deviance, the dramatizing delirium or the mad person communicates with the others and acts out for the community a shared delirium. Dramatizing delirium echoes a collective consciousness. Walcott criticizes the war and the epic genre that celebrates death and suffering through the figure of Odysseus, and also his contemplation, and also fragmented memory and delirium. positive feature of madness. By voicing the undisclosed and secret truths of war, Odysseus purges, relieves, and releases his psyche. He is only able to regain control of his mind after he articulates his pent-up thoughts. In this way, Odysseus accommodates himself to the disillusioning circumstances of home. And also, we can see that this is how Glissant's concept of delirium resonates with Baba's accommodation. Second Troy. Walcott criticizes the retributive justice of mythic gods that is celebrated in epic works and shows the abhorrence of war through Penelope. Walcott's Penelope, unlike her Homeric counterpart, reacts harshly to the slaughter that has taken place in her house, and she rebukes Odysseus for his bloody vengeance and likens Odysseus to a butcher that has made her home a second Troy. Going the extra mile. Through the figure of Odysseus, we also explained how Ditto can set the stage for Rito. If the direct or straightforward is presumed to be the shortest route home, Walcott suggests that the circular journey involving opacity and aggression can also take us home. Conclusion. It is only by violently expelling the suitors or colonizers from his homeland that Odysseus is able to liberate his mind. Odysseus's verbal delirium is an outlet through which he purges himself of his feeling of guilt and trauma. After being haunted by trauma and aggression of war that affected his psyche, Fanonian violence and Glissant's conception of Ditto constitutes strategies of resistance and accommodation that enable Odysseus's mental and physical integration, and also the assertion of his identity allows him to arrive home. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you found it useful. Please follow this channel as I try to share with you what I have learned. I wish you the best, and until the next video, farewell my friends.